This is Never Close the Inquiry with Nick Hagan. Welcome to Never Close the Inquiry, where I aim to demystify the right for the left and the left for the right, where if you come as a conservative, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about liberals, and if you come as a liberal, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about conservatives, with the whole idea that over time we'll create better conversations, better relationships, better arguments, and maybe 80 or 90 more steps down the road, a better country. Okay, so I'm here with Rick Robison. Okay, longtime family friend, grew up with your daughter, and Rick, you are here because you spent a significant period of time in the Central Intelligence Agency, and then since then, I believe have done some time, contracting still over in the Middle East, and then also now you have a venture you're working on that you're excited about, you've been doing for a few years, and we want to talk about that too.
Yes, for sure.
So let's start it. I was thinking we could do this more or less in two parts. We can talk about your work for the government, and then we can talk about your work now.
Okay,
Legacy
good.
Generation. So first off, and a lot of these questions, I don't know the answers to them, even though I have known you for a long time. How did you end up in the CIA?
It was not what I had intended initially, but I went to school at the American University in Cairo. And so I was in the Middle East learning Arabic and enjoying that part of the world a lot, and the people. They were fascinating to me. And while I was in Egypt, I had an experience that I think some of the things you do as a mediator, it hit home so hard.
Yeah.
One day we were there at the school, and we had the opportunity to go to Alexandria and to spend time on the beach, just as it was a holiday for a few days from school. While we were there, I was with a couple of friends. I kind of got good friends with several Jewish young men that were also going to school there. Their families wanted them to learn about the Arab culture, and they were wealthy Jews from the U.S. It was fascinating. But anyway, we were together sitting on the beach, and we were watching Arabs, or Egyptian Arabs. And you remember, in the Middle East, you've got Arabs from Morocco to Iraq.
Right.
And they're very different. And the languages, even their language dialects, are quite a bit different. But anyway, the Egyptians have their own special way. And there were two young groups, young men, I would say in their 20s, were playing volleyball against each other. They were not, I don't think, from the same family. They had just kind of got a game going on the beach, and they had a net up, and they were going at it. And all of a sudden, one of them, I was watching, fascinated with the game, the way they were playing. They were very intense. And one of the young men said something, and immediately both sides just rose up, exploded, and started fighting each other right on the beach. And one of the guys picked up one of these beach tent poles and was swinging that thing back and forth, and it looked like they were going to kill somebody.
Yeah.
And these two groups of young men went at each other for about a minute or two, and all of a sudden, I noticed at the side there was a couple of older men, and they were arguing amongst each other. And what they were doing was they were trying to determine which one would be the mediator between these two rival families, essentially. I think they were maybe they were related, but they had some definite differences. And so finally, one of the old men that was determined to be the mediator came out and got in between these young men, groups of men. And he began to go to one side, and he went to the other side. And he talked to the other side, and back and forth, back and forth. And I would say within about 10 minutes of negotiation, he had the young men calm down. And within another 5 or 10 minutes, they were playing volleyball again together. And I thought, they're going to kill, somebody's going to get killed. But yet then I looked at them, and I noticed that none of the young men were bleeding. I mean, they looked like they were ready to draw blood. Yeah. None were bleeding. They all seemed to be what they were doing is they were fighting, but it was more of a show to show that they were not going to back down, but they were pulling their punches. And the one swinging the pole was not really hitting. He was not hitting hard because they knew that if they drew blood, it would change the dynamic completely. And so that mediator was able to get in between them before it got too serious. He calmed them down, and pretty soon they're playing volleyball again together. And so I think that the work that you do to try to bring concepts from both sides together, I think this is really important. And I also think it's admirable because in our world today, there are not very many people doing that anymore. People have determined what side they're on, and they're there. And in true Middle East fashion, they're staying on their side. And and I think that it would make a whole lot of sense if we could get away from that to some degree. And I agree with what you're saying. At the same time, the thing that taught me, I think more than anything in the agency, the lesson I learned was that you have to take a position. Eventually, you're going to get to a point where you can no longer be on that fence, and you want to make the best choice you can. You want to decide what is the best thing going forward for myself, for my family, and for the people around me, the people I love, and for everyone. And so that's a challenge for the mediator. I mean, your work is cut out for it's cut out for you. It's going to be tough to do what you're trying to do. But I admire it. I admire that very much so. Anyway, so I was over there studying, and I was contacted, in fact, by an officer of the embassy, the American embassy, there in Cairo, and he said, your Arabic is really good, and we hear good things. And I thought, you hear good things? And they said, yeah, but we would like to talk to you in the States, not here. So after I'd finished school there and got a master's actually that next year, I was contacted by an individual back in my home and told to meet them in a hotel downtown, in downtown Salt Lake City. Went down there and walked down the hall, came to the room number, and the door opened. When I knocked, the door opened, and a guy reached out, grabbed me, pulled me in, shut the door. And that began a process that went on for about a year. I was flown back to Washington about 4 or 5 times. Tested. It was fascinating, really.
And they're testing your Arabic?
Everything.
Okay.
They're testing my emotions, my strength, my eyesight, my hearing, my ability to handle stress, if you get thrown into a difficult situation, how and they would role play things. They would have things happen. Then I thought afterwards, oh, okay, that's what that's about. And it was fascinating because they said, we can't just go home. We can't tell you whether we're going to hire you or not. We can't. And after a year, we're out of savings. My wife and I, we've got 2 little girls, and I thought, how in the world is this going to end? They will not tell me I've got to get a job or do something. I can't keep working on this process.
Okay, so you did your undergrad at
University of Utah.
Okay, there we go. So you did your undergrad at the U, and then you're going to go over to Cairo to get a master's.
I went into the Middle East Center at the University of Utah.
Got it. Okay.
And did a semester study abroad at the American University in Cairo.
Got it.
They have a program they've integrated with the Middle East Center up at the university.
Got it. Okay.
So it was a good program because it was intensive. What it was an intensive Arabic program for a summer semester.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But so you get contacted by the CIA. I assume it's the CIA at this point.
I was really naive, and I didn't know a lot, but I was trying to figure it out. I assumed that that's probably what it was, but maybe I thought, maybe it's the FBI or maybe somebody else. And so eventually I figured out who it was because they told me. And after a year, I went back for the last interview, and I talked to somebody in their Middle East division, high up, muckety-muck of some kind. And they said, it sounds interesting. Don't call us, we'll call you. So I went to the airport, got on the plane, went home, and I thought, oh, gee, I have no idea what's going on here. Well, 3 days later, it was a Friday, I got a call from Washington. They said, we have a group that will be training, special training. You'll be training for 2 years intensively starts on Monday. This is Friday. It starts on Monday. If you can be in Washington, and so I think they kind of probably took me off the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah.
They're trying to put these classes together. In fact, I know that because when I was being evaluated, the psychiatrist worked on me for about 2 weeks.
Huh.
And he had all of these charts. It's the most amazing thing. I wish everybody could do this because you learn so much about yourself, about your intelligence, about your IQ type intelligence, but yet your street smarts, your effectiveness with that, utilizing what you have. And when I finished with him going through and evaluating, and any one of these guys could end the process immediately.
Yeah.
But he said, Rick, I want to. It was all first names. They didn't, it was very. In fact, in all the training, you use a different name and so forth. But he says, Rick, I want to talk to you about your charts. I don't normally do this, he said, but I want to show you. And he pulled me in and he laid out all this stuff that he had done. And it was back, this was back before heavy use of computers. I mean, they had computers, but it was a lot of handwork that had been done. And he showed me my chart and he said, your intellectual capacity is actually below the average of the person we hire for the type of job you're going to do. So your intellectual capacity is down here. But we've shown from the testing that you are able to maximize and really utilize that limited intelligence you've got. And so actually your effective intelligence rate is up here, and we think that it's in the proper margins that will work.
How did you take that when he told you that?
And that's what I told him. I says, I'm not sure if that's a compliment or not. But anyway, I was just fascinated with the whole system, and the way it was done. And he said, yeah, you've got, you're kind of at the bottom of where we hire, at least as far as your scores go. But as we've tested you more, we can see that you're functioning at a much higher rate. So we think we can probably
work with it.
Yeah. So anyway, they hired me, and I began a 2-year training program that was several times I'd turn to my fellow trainees, and I'd say, "Can you believe this? They're paying us to do this." We're out on the range, and they've got government cars they pull in, and we're lighting them up with saws, with squad automatic weapons or M60. Just having a great time.
And so, is this in or around Langley?
Well, Langley is where CIA headquarters is,
right?
But they have training centers all over.
Got it. Okay, so what I'm trying to get to right here is, like, at this point, you're married, you have 2 daughters.
Yeah, and they're not seeing me hardly at all, and that was concerning me.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's one of the reasons, jumping ahead to the end of my time, I finally realized that I'm not going to be able to raise my kids if I keep doing this. And then I noticed as I looked at the officers I was working with, the fellow officers, and I was in operations, so we were stuff in the field. We weren't, at headquarters. So we're out in the field, and just about every single one of the officers that I worked with had been divorced or were single, had been divorced and were single. And I thought, this was before, when I started, it was before cell phones.
Yeah.
And so I would be off, working on a project for several days. My wife had no idea where I was. And
couldn't tell her.
I couldn't contact her.
Yeah.
And so you take your wife, your family. This was I've finally determined that this was an excellent job for a single person. A difficult one for a family person to do the type of work that I was involved in.
Yeah.
For the time and of course I was working in the Middle East, and it was during the time when terrorism was a big issue. It was also during the Iran-Iraq War, which was a terrible, bloody war between, the Ayatollahs of Iran and Saddam Hussein of Iraq, and so we were in that region of the Gulf. Stationed there for a time, and so we monitored this and the missile exchanges, and I mean they wiped out an entire generation of young Iranians in that war. Then that war ended within yards of where they started, so they didn't really accomplish anything else Saddam had. And then later, Saddam invaded Kuwait, and I knew that area really well, but we were assigned in a different Middle Eastern country at the time. So the Gulf War Task Force pulled me in to do some work in preparation for the liberation of Kuwait. And then after that, I resigned. But then after 9/11, there was a number of opportunities for contract work,
Mm-hmm.
mainly with the U.S. military. So I went back over with some partners I had and did work there after 9/11.
Can you, what does, when you say contract work, what does that actually mean?
Well, it can be anything, but
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of the work that's done is done by staff officers, but a lot of it is contracted.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the things that the government would prefer probably not to deal with, or maybe they don't have the expertise. They feel like. One of the companies I worked with, the Iraqis, the Americans were training the Iraqi military to handle policing and to stand against some of the radical groups that were rising up, and some of the former Saddam loyalists that were now starting to attack the Americans that were there on the ground in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And so I worked with a company that armored, deuce and a half truck, the 2.5 ton trucks, military trucks. We would armor them with steel plating,
Mm-hmm.
and working with the military. Oftentimes there was liaison that was required between the company that was actually doing the work, and we would contract much of that. And so there's all kinds of contract work being done. Anytime you have a war zone, either before, during, or after that war, and a lot of times it's pretty boring. Most of the time it's pretty routine type work, but it's work that needs to be done,
Right.
And
Well,
it generally paid well, and I loved being there because I could use my Arabic, and I
Yeah.
enjoyed the people, and the food is my favorite, so
Huh.
it worked out well.
Yeah, my gosh. And so I guess two more questions on that.
Uh-huh.
So you go through this 2-year training process. Obviously, some of it you get to have a lot of fun. You're blowing up government cars with high-powered weaponry.
Well, that's one of the benefits.
Right.
They bring in all these old cars, and they make sure that they always leave a little gas in the gas tank. Because you can't light up a car with a machine gun. You can with the tracers if you hit that gas tank. Or if you puncture that gas tank and drip some gas underneath, then hit it with tracer, then it'll go up. Yeah.
Nice. And so when they're like, basically, what all do they train you how to do? If you could, like a
Well,
yeah.
it was a long program, and I'll tell you, some of it was very difficult for me, and for everybody. I mean, for all the trainees, particularly the ops stuff. It's difficult. A lot of it I'd prefer not to talk about, but
That's fair.
there was about probably a fourth of it maybe in military. We got to go through jump school, and it was, get the jump wings and jump out of planes. We
Yeah.
had to do the 5 jumps, and a lot of the military, planning, hostage rescue, different things. A lot of the things that we would probably not use as an ops officer, but they wanted us to understand as much as possible about the world, about military operations, to be able to experience, what the soldiers are going through. And so if we're supporting them in the intel functions, that we'd have a little better idea what was going on. So it was a
Yeah.
familiarization type training. And then of course the operations training is very intense, and that's something that is probably best not talked about.
Fair. No, well, I think, I would imagine, and you can kind of yes, no, this sort of thing, but, they're training you to really be competent in a very wide range of possible scenarios that you might encounter.
Well, that's the idea,
Yeah.
is to do that. And I think some of the trainers were excellent, some of them were not so good.
Yeah.
And, different classes have different personalities or different dynamics about them. Our group got along pretty well. There wasn't a lot of competition and strain. Even though you are in competition with the other officers in your training group, because they're going to rank you towards the end, and you want to be towards the top for a number of reasons.
Yeah.
And so it was, it was great. It was a good experience. I see some of my former colleagues every now and then. There's one that's in the media. You see him every now and then. You'd recognize him probably if you saw him. But they were good people. They recruited some of the finest some of the smartest people. Oh, I remember one time we were in the officers' club, and there were several of the guys and a couple of women with us. They had in our group we had 22 men and 10 women that were
Wow. All right.
that were in that training group. We
Yeah.
we trained together for 2 years, pretty much. And so we were in the officers' club, and somebody pulls out a game of what's it called? The old where you try to guess the. It used to be very popular. Anyway, you can see how long ago it's been since I've used it. Trivial Pursuit.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So you've got to, and somebody reads. There was one of the officers in there. I think he had a photographic memory, and he did crossword puzzles on his spare time.
Yeah.
And he said he knew every single answer throughout that whole trip. We had the time to go through the whole Trivial Pursuit game, and he knew every single answer. It was amazing. And we would study, and he'd look at it. I remember him reading a page.
Yeah.
And he was done. It'd take me for, we had to look at things we were studying. We had to memorize them, and then we had to present them before camera so that to show how quickly we could assimilate, the information. And so I was amazed at the quality of people that they hired from all over the country. Most of them were right out of the university. I was a little older. I was about 30 years old when I went in, but most of them were in their early 20s, right out of the university. I'd had some business experience, real world experience, Middle East travel, and some other things. And I think that was one of the reasons that they hired me, because I'd had a little bit more experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is fascinating. How much of that training do you think has stuck through to today?
Well, it's like anything. If you use it, if you don't, you lose it. But it's fun. I share some of the really crazy operations that I was involved with sometimes with my grandkids, and that gets their attention. It's hard to get kids their attention anymore, but there's so much noise in the in the world everywhere. But occasionally I can get them cornered and tell them a little bit. But that's
it's not everyone's grandpa that was in CIA ops.
But that's it's like anything. You lose the skills you don't practice. You lose over time.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
But it's a confidence builder, I think, in many ways, because I look at it and I say to myself, okay, I survived that, and it was tough. It was tough training. I guess it's like going through law school. You get through law school and you figure, okay, I'm not sure how much I know, but at least I know I survived this, right?
Yeah. I think what you're talking about is a good deal more difficult than what I did, but conceptually, I could see the comparison being made. Certainly some people would talk about law school that way, but I think I do think CIA training is probably a couple of exponents more difficult. But okay, so you spent some number of years in the CIA.
Yeah,
it's like late '80s, early '90s.
Late '80s, mid '80s, late '80s, early '90s, and then I came back, and then 9/11 occurred. I went back over, did some contract work for a number of companies. The thing that really troubled me, though, is when I would come back after having been gone for a while, and during the 2000s, during the Bush administration, the first George W. Bush, and then during the Obama administration, it really troubled me to see the changes that were taking place in this country. And what I saw was people I knew who were the good old conservative Democrats. I was raised in a Republican, very conservative family, but we weren't that different when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. Between our Democratic friends, we had the same values. We had the same understanding, I think, of the world. The Democrats were more anti-war. They always have been anti-war, which I cannot figure out today when I see the support that they have for the Ukraine, in this Ukraine war. This just boggles my mind to see the left so into this, because they were never that way before. And then I think a lot of the Democrats I know who I grew up with younger, the older ones, like Kennedy, I don't think they would recognize the Democratic Party today. Even the Republican Party has moved further to the left. And that's a process that I've noticed. I'm 72, And I've watched this
I would not have guessed that.
well, I've watched, Nick, I've watched this all my life.
Yeah.
When I was a teenager, my friends weren't interested in watching the news. I watched Walter Cronkite's reports each week on the Vietnam War. I had a cousin who was in Vietnam.
Yeah.
And he was telling me things that Walter Cronkite was not telling me. And I thought, I wonder what's happening in the media. There's a change that, and I saw that shift during the 1970s into the 80s. And when I went to work with the agency, it was a very conservative bunch in there.
Yeah.
Guys I know now that work, they say it's woke. I mean, it's changed so much in all of these government agencies. And I think a lot of it are the young people who have been, I hate to say it, but I think indoctrinated by their schooling. And they get into an organization like the agency and they bring that thinking with them. Their parents, the older officers are in there, are leaving, had been, and I know this from after 9/11, leaving in droves because this thing, the culture here is changing so much in the agency, and it's becoming interested in things. They were so determined that they would say the right things, do the right things, do the things that were politically more along the lines of I think what the party is doing today, and so that concerns me a lot because I see Democrats today and they're not like the ones that I grew up with. They've changed a lot. Even many of the Republicans have.
Yeah.
And so I came back from overseas and I was concerned about what my kids were learning in school, what they were being taught by the institutions, what I used to think were sacred institutions, very capable people had changed, and it's a progressive change.
And so these concerns started to arise like post 9/11 when you came back? Okay.
Post 9/11. Yeah, during the mid 2000s, I would say, when I was doing contract and I'd come back and I'd see these changes. I had a daughter who had a history program or history assignment she needed to do at school, and she brought home her textbook. Mm-hmm. And I'm, history, this is my thing. So I says, yeah, of course, glad to help you. And so I picked up her book and I looked at the inside of that history book, and it had 3 pages, detailed pages on Harriet Tubman, Araminta Ross, but she's known as Harriet Tubman, but that was her real name. On Harriet Tubman, fascinating story. And what they had in there was great. And I thought, this is wonderful. But then I turned the page, they had about maybe a little more than 1 paragraph on George Washington. 3 pages, 1 paragraph. And most of what it said about George Washington, well, he had slaves and this type of thing. Mm-hmm. And I thought, this is terrible. These kids they're not being taught about the incredible miracles surrounded, George Washington when he fought before the Revolutionary War, when he fought in the war, he led men into battle. He would be at the front of them. The British would unleash barrages at him. His clothing would be shredded. He would be untouched. He was never wounded in the war. The Battle of Monongahela in the French and Indian War, George Washington was 23. Mm-hmm. He was leading a group of Virginia militiamen backing the British troops going against the French and Indians, and they had a battle at Monongahela in Pennsylvania, and the British lost. The French and Indians' policy was to shoot the officers first. Mm-hmm. And they knocked the British officers off their horses. The Indians would get on them and scalp them. And the American militiamen, the Virginians, were being also killed, any of their officers. George Washington became, eventually, as the battle continued, the only officer still on his horse that was leading the British and the Americans. And the colonel that was leading the British regulars was down and dying. He'd been shot. He was dying. So Washington said, somebody's got to take command here. There's no officers still alive. Mm-hmm. And so they had women with them as well, camp followers. And so they were really concerned about what was going to happen if the French and Indians got a hold of the rest and they're wounded. Mm-hmm. And so Washington then began to back up with his horse. He had his sword, and he would lead in front of his men as they retreated. And he organized an orderly retreat. They finally got back into Virginia. And he said, at the end, he wrote a letter to this is well documented. Mm-hmm. In fact, these stories and he said this was a miraculous event because they fired at me over and over and over, and I have holes in my coats and my hat, but I was not touched at all. This story used to be told in every young child's textbook in school up until the FDR administration in the 1930s, and it was pulled at that time. And it's since then we've just seen, it seems like a concerted effort to pull anything spiritual, anything religious out of the history books, expunge it. You know, it's down the memory hole. And I think this is wrong because this showed, Washington in his letters home, he said, I have been spared and I don't know why. These are important things to know about his thinking, about his mindset. I mean, whether you believe in God or not, this motivated Washington incredibly so. Because a number of years later, he was traveling, and this is again well documented in a number of journals, with men who were with him. He was approached by a group of Indians, and one of them was a chief of the Potawatomi tribe who had been at that battle. And he was a young brave, actually was a young chief at the time. And he says, I told my men, he said, see that tall, Washington was 6'3". He was the largest target on the field of battle. Yeah. All the other men are, 5'7", 5'6", 5.
Right.
He's 6'3", he's on this horse. And the chief said, I want to talk to the great leader of the Long Knives, the great fighter who is being blessed by the Great Spirit that day. He says, I fired my musket, and I am the best shot in my tribe. He says, I fired my musket at you 17 times. I had 17 fair shots at you. Close, very close. And this battle was right at close. Yeah. And he said, I was not able to hit you. And after 17 shots, I said to my men, do not shoot at him anymore. We cannot hit him. He is protected by the Great Spirit. And that battle ended. Washington was able to organize a retreat. He was not touched. In his letters home, he said, I feel that divine providence has preserved my life for a reason. I don't know why. But this Indian chief then, or this Potawatomi chief then said after that, you will become the leader of a great nation. And this was all written down in the men who were there in their journals, well documented. We have, in the Library of Congress, there's a number of these accounts. And as I said, they were put in all of the textbooks up until the 1930s. But then that story about Washington and the Battle of Monongahela was pulled out. I mean, they talk about the battle, but they don't mention anything about these miraculous events. And you could see that. And I just thought, oh, this is terrible. And so I began with my grandkids about 10 years ago to produce what I call the Family Freedom Manual series. And that is kind of graduated into what I think is more appropriate to families and so forth, is the Heroes for Freedom Manual series. And I've got four volumes of this right now. And I've identified what I think are the 100 irreplaceable heroes in American history. Most of them, most Americans have never heard of, but heroes and heroines both, who changed the course of the country's history and the history of the world. And not all of the heroes in this 100 are Americans. There are many from Europe and other parts of the world that have just really impacted for good the history of our country and the history of our world. And I think if you were to go back and remove these individuals from the story, our world would be a very different place, probably a despotic place, a cauldron of really terrible conditions for people to live in the world. These people changed the course of history. And on the cover here, you see this James Armistead Lafayette. He was the spy for Washington at the Battle of Yorktown, and he went. Most of the black slaves were fleeing because the British would give them freedom if they joined the British side. Well, James Armistead, or James, he was just known as James. He names himself after his two heroes after the war, Armistead and Lafayette, which was the Marquis de Lafayette that was fighting with Washington. Yeah. But James came to Washington and he said to him, sir, I know that it would make more sense for me to go with the British, but I feel that God has told me that I feel very strongly that your cause is just and your cause is what I want. And so he began, and Washington said, go to the British camp at Yorktown. They had General Cornwallis, and the British were there, and Washington had moved in positions around them. And he said, go and join with the British camp. Well, he did, and Cornwallis was so very impressed by him that he made James his his aide de camp
Oh, no kidding.
with the general. So Washington's top spy
Yeah.
is in the camp, right in all the
Yeah.
meetings with General Cornwallis, and so he
Yeah.
essentially helped deliver Cornwallis and the British at the Battle of York. And the Battle of Yorktown was the key
Right.
victory in the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
After that, essentially the war was over, and the Americans had won. And Washington, and later, after all this was over, he went back and Washington says, James, I'm going to make sure, because you fought, and I promised all blacks that would come and fight for us, I would give them freedom. So he went to the leaders of Virginia, where James lived. And Washington says, I want you to free the slave. In fact, his master that he had, his name was I think John Armistead. His name was Armistead, said also, I want to free James because James deserves it if anybody does. He's sacrificed so much and risked his life during the war, and it gave us so much. And Virginia said, no, the law says specifically that you have to be a soldier, having fought in the front, in the ranks with the soldiers. James was a spy, so we can't free him. And Washington, the Marquis de Lafayette, everyone was upset about that. James went home back to his master, Armistead, and lived there for a time. Well, the Marquis de Lafayette and other leaders, including his master Armistead, began writing letters to the Virginia delegation saying, this is the most unjust thing you can do. You have got to free James and give him his freedom. Mm-hmm. And so finally, 4 years after the end of the Revolution, finally they passed a regulation just for him and allowed him to be free. And so he was married, and he got a little farm in the Virginia countryside. Well, many years later, this was in the 1800s, he's an older man now, and the Marquis de Lafayette, who fought with Washington's French officer who headed up the spy network for Washington, was visiting America. And he was riding in his carriage through these little Virginia hamlets, just wanting to see some of the areas that he had fought in when he fought with Washington. And he looked into the crowd, and he saw this face shining. It was James in the crowd, and he could see this. And he said, stop the carriage immediately. And he jumps out, and he runs over, and they embrace each other, and they talk about the war and about their colleagues, living and dead, and the experiences that they had. And this is a man that is essentially unknown by Americans.
Yeah.
Nobody knows James Armistead. So he was so happy when he received his freedom that he named himself after his former master, Armistead, and Lafayette. And he died about 1830 in obscurity. Mm-hmm. We don't even know the exact date that he died. Among his family, he had a very tight-knit, good family, but very few Americans ever knew this. The story was kept by a couple of people. It was pulled out of some older journals in the 1900s and kind of put together to see who this man was. And that's what I determined to do with this, is to highlight these heroes that Americans are not hearing anymore. I think it's important for our kids. They need to understand what the potential of this country is for them. Look what it's done. People who have had very little opportunity. Look what they've done with this. And I think it's a tough world, and it's not an equal world, and it never has been, and it never will be. We all have different skills, different abilities, different opportunities, different luck, different blessings, however you want to say it. Mm-hmm. But I think it's important for our kids to realize that they have opportunities in this country unlike any other area in the world. And I've worked in Africa, I've worked in the Middle East, I've worked in Southwest Asia, I've worked in Russia. Mm-hmm. I spent time right after the collapse of the Soviet Union working in Russia. This country is the country that people around the world risk everything to come to, because they know the freedom and the opportunities are here. I mean, I talk about American exceptionalism. I believe that with all my. You look at the Nobel Peace Prize winners. Almost half are Americans, or grew up and studied in America under the American system. Almost half, and you have you go over to these countries in Europe, and you see just acres and acres of thousands of crosses of Americans who have given their lives to destroy tyranny and to free peoples in other lands. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're everywhere. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have died in these wars. And of course, it's a very small percentage to what other countries have lost. But Americans, a lot of Americans figure that, well, we can just stay here and we don't need to get involved. No, I think there are things in the world we can do, and we have done. And we have contributed a lot. And so when people say, well, every country's exceptional in their own way, well, in some ways that's true, but there's no country. Look what the world might look like today had there not been a United States to stand against Nazi Germany and Hitler.
Right.
Had the British been left on their own to do that? I'm not sure, and the Russians, I'm not sure that they could have won that war without the help of the United States. You look at the Civil War, the history of the Civil War and the sacrifices that were made. And yet after the Civil War ended, you have this group of people, I call them proto-progressives, that began to show up in politics and all. Many of them were educated from the university and claiming that the Civil War was fought for northern capital markets. That Northerners didn't care about the South. They didn't care about the slaves. They didn't care that much about the Union, but they wanted to hold things together because they wanted to make money. Now, I have a great grandfather who fought in the Civil War. Now, I challenge you to find anybody my age that has a great-grandfather, not a great-great or a great-great-great,
Yeah.
but a great-grandfather who fought in the Civil War. He went in as a 14-year-old drummer boy, and he fought. And I know because I family records and journals and talking with family members, he fought to free the slaves, and he fought to save the Union. And that it was a pure desire. And hundreds of thousands of young men, mostly some older, gave their lives. There wasn't a family in America that didn't have some kind of a loss in that war.
Yeah.
And when that thing ended, Lincoln felt that he needed to make even a greater sacrifice, and I think he even saw that he would probably end up giving his life to save this nation, to keep it together. Otherwise, had the South won, I have all kinds of stories in these of people who contributed to saving the Union that are just amazing. But had the South won, they wanted to break off,
Right.
Confederate States of America. We probably would have ended up with other statelets in the West, some of them slave, some of them free, different ones. And these countries would be perpetually hostile, different types of governments, perpetually hostile into perpetuity. And when the next century came and communism, and particularly fascism and Nazism rose to power in Europe, we would not have been able to stop them had it not been for a strong and united United States. It was essential that we do that.
Yeah.
And are we perfect? No. No country is perfect. And everywhere you go, you look at what happened to the American Indian people, the Native Americans as they're called. I served a mission on the Navajo reservation, and maybe the younger ones are different. But when I was a young missionary at that time in the 70s, they wanted to be called. The Navajos didn't want to be called Native American. They thought that was. It just didn't sound right. They wanted to be called Navajos, their tribal name, or American Indian. But almost every tribe I know, they would prefer to be called their tribal name.
Yeah.
But if you look at that history and how that transpired, those same events, terrible events, with one stronger group and a weaker group, happened all over the world, every area of the world. You go to Turkey and see what the Turks did to the indigenous people, people who were there before the Turks arrived, and the Europeans, and the Germanic peoples, when they came in, when the Aryan peoples, swept into Europe. Things that happened, the things that the Han Chinese had done to the peoples that they, it's universal. It's a terrible universal trait that you see. And the thing that's different, and the thing I love about this country, is that you have people here who are willing to give their lives and their treasure, their fortunes, to try to put an end to this injustice in the world. And we fought to end slavery, And when we were fighting to end slavery, was still prevalent in most of the rest of the world. It was out, in British, it was, and in some places, in Mexico and other places, it had been outlawed. But most of the world, slavery, and slavery still exists today. Parts of the Middle East, I've had several experiences dealing with that. So I look at America, if you talk about American exceptionalism, I just can't see that there's any other country that has contributed more in blood and treasure and in an ideology of freedom, a concept that people, around the world relate to. and I saw this with people I worked with overseas. They loved that concept that America was a place that you could go and become anybody you wanted to be.
Let me tease out a couple of things here, because a lot of very interesting subjects there. So, one, you're talking about, oh gosh, man, there's really a lot. So, talking about this, okay, so I have like 12 questions out of that.
Sure.
Okay, so first off, how these 100 heroes, these stories were taken at, some of the story about James Lafayette that you mentioned, and a couple of others that were taken out of the history books at some point. So, how did you find out about them? Because you weren't born in the 1930s.
No.
Or the 1920s. Or
No.
Yeah.
No, well, one of the things that one of the segments that we did when I worked for where I worked was they hammered into us that you do not pursue something unless you have studied and figured out every element of it, so that you know what you're talking about. You've got to. You cannot, shoot from the hip, because people's lives are at stake in many of the cases.
Right.
So you've got to be accurate. And so I learned how to research. And with today, researching is, you can find just about anything, anywhere. And I've gone back to a number of sources right out of the Library of Congress.
No kidding.
Yeah, where a lot of these things have been kept. For example, I think one of the best ones, if you're talking about heroes, you've got the known, most people know the known ones,
Sure.
Washington, Lincoln.
Yeah.
These are great heroes for several reasons, for many reasons. And then there are many who are unknown. And when I find just a tidbit on one that's unknown, I pursue it. If I go anywhere I have to. And one of these stories comes from, his name was Lieutenant Colonel James Rustling, who was the assistant or the secretary or aide to General Dan Sickles, who was in the Battle of Gettysburg. And this story I'm going to tell you about comes from that. And I researched that from James Rustling's book, who was at the meeting with Dan Sickles when Lincoln meets with him. It's the only place this story is recorded. It's an amazing story. And Rustling wrote it down and kept it, and he published it later in his book called Men and Incidents I've Known from the Civil War, something like that. It was James Rustling, Lieutenant Colonel James. Actually, he's General James Rustling by the end of the war.
Yeah.
And he wrote this, and it was published, and it's in the Library of Congress. But then the book went out of in the early 1900s. It went out of print. Well, there's been so much interest in this story that I'm about to tell you that they started republishing. The book's available now on Amazon again. And I'll tell you what happened. Lincoln started out his political career, locally, but when he was elected to the national election to president in 1860, he was elected with only 39% of the vote. There was 4 Democratic candidates running, so they split the rest of the. Lincoln got only 39. Of course, he got majority of the Electoral College, but he had only 39%. He was elected, so he became president. Well, immediately the South began to break off. One by one, states began to secede from the Union. And Lincoln was doing everything he can. He said, don't worry about your slaves. We need to stay together. We can work this out. And so Lincoln started out as a president being he wasn't religious at all. He'd been raised, his father was hard on him. He was a strong kid, and he grew up, he was smart, self-educated, and he became a very successful attorney. And he always felt like he really didn't need God. It wasn't important to him in his life. And so he came into office really quite irreligious. He was not particularly so. Well, the first year in office when the war began, he began to see that this was much larger a problem than he thought. The nation was coming apart at the seams. And he knew intrinsically, we can see it from his writings. He could see the future, I believe. In fact, I often refer to Abraham Lincoln as a prophet because his insights were amazing. Some of the statements he would make about if we divide this nation, we are planting the seeds of despotism around our own doors. And he talked about how this would affect the world, that we were fighting not only to save this nation, but to save the world. And but the first year of the war, the northern troops were losing every battle practically. The South was winning. They had the best generals. The South, finally Robert E. Lee was brought in as the general for the South. And so Lincoln, later in the summer of 1861, September, he said, we need to have a national fast. He called it a day of humiliation. That's how words have changed. Humility,
Right,
a day
yeah,
of humility.
yeah.
And so they had fasting and prayers. But you could see in his writings, he really wasn't focused on it that much. He had somebody, I think, suggested that, and he thought, well, that's a good idea. So,
why not?
So he didn't. So anyway, we go through the fall of 1861. The Union is continuing to lose. The winter of 1861, 1862, typhoid fever hits Washington, D.C., and it's killing people all over the place. And the North is continuing to lose the war and losing battles. And Lincoln's in his family. Mary Lincoln is his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. They have two little boys. They have an older boy who's in school. They have another boy who had died earlier from something. But they had two younger boys, Tad and Willie. And both of those little boys, they're probably 9, 10, 11 years old, had got typhoid fever. And they were dying in the White House. And Lincoln was so busy with the war, Mary Lincoln just was so upset at her husband because he was not there to nurture his boys, and they really looked up to him, particularly Willie. They said that the president and little Willie were very close. Lincoln thought that Willie was most like him. He felt like, and so these boys and Willie dies from the typhoid. Yeah. Mary Lincoln collapses. She just can't. She loved this little boy. Her friend said that she just adored this sweet little kid. He had the best disposition of anybody. And it said that in the account that when Willie died, Lincoln finally got to his bedside and sat down and said, "Oh, my dear little boy, he was too good for this world, and God has taken him home." You can see a transformation that's starting, and that loss of Willie really got President Lincoln's attention. Now, Tad is still sick, and he's dying. So Lincoln doesn't know what to do. Well, the Army, nearby in the hospital, there's a big military hospital in Washington. There's a woman there named Rebecca Pomeroy. And the head of the hospital knows that Lincoln family is struggling. So they send Rebecca Pomeroy to the White House. And immediately, she is so amazing. Everything she touches gets better. Everything she's like a breath of fresh air and sunshine. And she soon has little Tad out of bed. He has this little miniature military uniform he had made for him because he loves the military. And he's always talking about, he's got little soldiers. And he's running around the White House. She goes to Mary Lincoln's bed. Pretty soon she's got Mary sitting up and doing things. And finally, President Lincoln goes to her and says, "Rebecca, you have been working miracles in my family. Why? How are you able to do this?" And Lincoln says, "I know your background. You've lost your two little children. You lost to typhoid last year. Yeah. Your husband, you lost to typhoid, and your mother died as well." And she says, "Yes, sir. And also I have a teenage son who's fighting on the front lines with the Northern forces." And she's, every one of these battles are losing thousands of men. Yeah. She's expecting any minute to hear about her son. And Lincoln says, "How can you be so happy?" And she says, "Mr. President, I will tell you, because I met God." And then she told a story about how she had felt like she was going to take her life, that she was worthless because she'd lost her family essentially, and her son had gone off to war. And she says, "I feel worthless." And she went to a church service, and she said, "I had a powerful, powerful experience that I cannot deny." And she said, then I realized, and a voice whispered to me, "There is too much suffering going on for you to be feeling sorry for yourself." Imagine that she's had so much loss. But the Spirit said, "No, it will be better for you if you get up and get going." So she was a nurse already. She went to the hospital and she became a very effective nurse. And then she went to Lincoln's. And so then we began to see Lincoln, Mary Lincoln, and Rebecca Pomeroy visiting these military hospitals, ministering to the troops and talking to them and talking to these wounded men. And then she would sit down with the president and with Mary Lincoln, and they would read scriptures at night. And one day, in one of those meetings, Lincoln just said, "I know what the problem is for this country. I can see it now. This country is under condemnation, both North and South, because of the sin of slavery." And he says, "I am going to write an Emancipation Proclamation, and I'm going to free the slaves." And so then he took that to his cabinet. And his cabinet officers just about went ballistic. And they said, "You're crazy, sir. You can't do that. If you do that, the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, these border states who are now neutral, they'll join the South because many of them have slaves. They'll join the South. The war will go on forever. We'll never win this war if you try to free the slaves." And he says, "No, man, I'm telling you, I understand what you're saying, and I respect your opinions, but I'm listening to a higher authority." During this time in the scriptures, he's writing notes, and we see this. So what I call the conversion, from apostate to prophet of President Lincoln. And so then you get into the summer after that, and Lincoln says, I've got this Emancipation Proclamation written. I'm going to issue it. And his cabinet says, that's not a good idea yet. We haven't had a victory. And Seward, William Seward, his Secretary of State, who was a close friend of Lincoln, Seward pulled him aside and says, "Sir, you've got to have a victory. We haven't had a victory. It's going to look like an act of desperation on your part to do that if we don't have a victory." And so he said, "Okay, let's wait." Well, a few weeks later, in a little unknown stream, essentially, in Maryland, the two armies, the South and the North, meet in a very miraculous way. In fact, there's another story that goes with this. I don't want to take your time to do it now. But it gave the North the impetus to know where to attack because they intercepted some intelligence in really a miraculous way. But anyway, they had a battle there at Antietam Creek, the bloodiest day in American history. 22,000 casualties on both sides. And even though the North did not win really a decisive victory, the South was beaten, and Robert E. Lee pulled his troops back into Virginia and back into the South. So Lincoln had his victory, so he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The healing began. And then we went into the winter of 1863. There was terrible losses, again, a loss for the Union at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Then in the spring, Lincoln said, I want to issue, and this time I really mean it, a day of humiliation, a day of humble prayer and fasting for this nation to survive. And they did. And he had special speeches, and you can see in his speeches his change of appreciation. And so right after that battle, right after the fasting, national fasting, was the Battle of Chancellorsville. And Chancellorsville, again, the South won that battle. But in that battle, the most important general for the South, Stonewall Jackson, rode out ahead of his men, and he was accidentally shot. He was just wounded in the hand and the arm. Right. And they thought, you're fine, you'll be okay. He was dead within 10 days. Right. And Robert E. Lee says, I have lost my right arm. He was the finest general he had. And so then Lee says, the only hope we have, and I'm going to tell you the story now about Dan Sickles. The only hope we have is to invade the North, to go up in through and terrorize the population so that they put pressure on the U.S. government to let us form our own country, the Confederate States. And he says, and what we'll do is we'll swing up through Pennsylvania, we'll swing down through, and we'll attack Washington, D.C. We'll capture the Capitol because in the process, we'll wipe out the Federal Army, the last of the Union Army, and we'll force President Lincoln to give us our freedom in the South and end the war, and we will win this war. And so they swing up through, and they go into a little town, a little hamlet called Gettysburg. And there, the Union armies meet them, led by their cavalry under General John Buford, the Northern general, brigadier general. And even though heavily outnumbered, Buford could see this battle is going to happen here at Gettysburg. And the side that's going to win is the one that grabs the high ground. And so he grabs the high ground above the Missionary Ridge above Gettysburg. And that battle then commences, and the rest of the forces move in, and they have a terrible 3-day battle. 3 days, 52,000 casualties, 3 days battle. Well, the first day of battle, one of the generals from the North was General Dan Sickles. And he had his forces, and he moved up a little bit too close, and his foot was hit with a cannonball, severed his foot. Just pretty much took it off. And so they grabbed him, they put a tourniquet on it, threw him on a buggy, sent him back to Washington to the hospital. So he's at the hospital trying to recuperate, and he's in a lot of pain. He's really suffering. And so he's sitting there in his bed in Washington. The Battle of Gettysburg has gone on, and now that battle has ended with a Union victory.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the people in Washington didn't think it would be. They figured the Union was going to lose again, and Washington would then be laid siege to.
Yeah.
And so they had brought up these incredible these gunships to try to protect the city. They had many of the people, cabinet members, senators, congressmen, were packing their families up to leave because they assumed. So Sickles is in this bed, and he's sick with his foot, and he's in bad shape. In walks his aide, James Rustling, and Rustling sits down and says, "Sir, what can I do for you?" Well, right in behind him walks in Abraham Lincoln and Tad. And Tad's wearing his little military uniform, his son. He goes with his father everywhere. So Lincoln sits down and he says, Dan, and he knew Dan. They were politicians. Dan had been a politician before the war, and then he'd gotten a senior position, a general position because of his connections, I think. But he was in there, and Lincoln said, "Dan, I'm concerned about you. How you doing?" And Dan's sitting there, and he says, "Well, I'm in bad shape, as you can see." And Lincoln says, "Well, tell me, how you feeling? I mean, what's your spirits like? Now, tell me about the men. Are they still want to fight? Are they still anxious?" And Dan says, "Yeah, the men are there, and they're doing good." And Lincoln says, "That's great. That's wonderful. Well, the war now that battle of Gettysburg is over. This is a day or two after the battle. So Lincoln knows that we have won. So Lincoln's in pretty good spirits because he was concerned about this, of course, obviously." And so Dan Sickles is sitting there and saying, "Sir, well, I understand that Washington was in uproar. Many people figured we were going to lose this battle of Gettysburg, and so they were getting ready to leave."
Yeah.
And Lincoln says, "Yeah, the cabinet was that way. There are many people who did. But I'll tell you, Dan, I was not worried." And General Sickles says, "Sir, everybody was worried about losing this battle. I mean, it was nip and tuck. We didn't know, until the third day whether we were going to win this battle." And Lincoln says, "Yeah, I know. I had my runners going back and forth giving me reports." And Lincoln says, "Yeah, I knew it would be fine. I knew everything would be good." And Sickles said, "Sir, you can't possibly believe that. I mean, how could anybody be so, essentially saying, how come you be so naive?" And Lincoln said, "Dan, if you really want to know, I will tell you." And again, James Rustling, his aide, is sitting there, and he's taking notes. Lincoln sits down in a chair, and he said, "This is the way it transpired, Dan. I was concerned about this battle like everyone. And when I heard that it had commenced in Gettysburg, my first runner had come to me and told me what had happened." He said, "I excused myself from my cabinet. I went into my room, and I knelt down, and I prayed." And he says, "As I was praying, I told the Lord, I said, 'Lord, these are your men out there giving their lives, and this is your war. And if you will help my men, if you will help these boys of mine out there, if you will stand by them in this upcoming battle of Gettysburg, if you will stand by them, I will stand by you.'" And he says at that point, Lincoln said, "I felt this incredible warm feeling spread over me and around me, like someone was holding me in their arms." And Lincoln said, "I knew that all would be well at Gettysburg." And he said, "Dan, and this is the why of it." And that account is written in Rustling's book. Again, out of print for many years. Nobody had really focused on it. It's now back and available from the Library of Congress. Fortunately, a lot of these accounts were kept in the Library of Congress. And Lincoln had at that point, and this was, of course, after Gettysburg, and the war would still go on for 2 more years almost.
Right.
But Lincoln knew at that point that God was with them and that he would stand with God. And you can see it in his writings. He's a completely different man up until he is assassinated in the next couple of years. So those kind of stories I think our kids need to hear. They need to understand them. Even if they don't believe them, they need to know the motivation of these great heroes and heroines.
Yeah.
There's so many of these that I could tell you.
That bridges me out. That's an interesting question. So, or it prompts an interesting question. That's a very moving story. So, my family's from the South. So my I couldn't tell you exactly how many greats, but
Georgia, right?
Yeah, Georgia.
Yeah, that's where I was born. I was born.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, I was born.
Where in Georgia?
Yeah, I was born at Camp Gordon, Fort Gordon.
Oh, nice. Very cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
my mother was born in Northwest Georgia in Rome and was
Yeah,
raised
Rome. I know where that
in
is.
Southwest Georgia in Moultrie.
Yeah.
And I still have a ton of family in Moultrie. And so
Right.
and in Alabama and then my wife is also from Georgia, so a lot of connections to the South. And if you go back, like in my family history, a number of people participated in the Civil War.
Right.
And they were wearing gray, as we would portray them today.
Right.
And and I actually think not descended from Robert E. Lee, but I think I feel like descended from his grandfather. So there's related, and then I
Right.
think related to Stonewall Jackson. Very Southern family, been there for hundreds of years.
Tremendous. Yeah.
And
Incredible people. I mean, they're just amazing. I mean, you can see it in the war. I mean, what they were able to accomplish with with very little. They were always outnumbered.
Right.
But just I look at it and I think, what are the greater issues here?
Right.
What
Well,
are we
and I'll
talking
tell you what the reason what strikes me now is, so my mother, when she was growing up in the 60s and 70s, I believe the war was still taught in the South as the War of Northern Aggression. And so, because it's kind of, it's nice. I don't want to say it's easy, but we can, look back on the 200 and nearly 50-year history of the country,
Right.
and look at some of these, some serious issues like slavery and others that, in certain respects, are long dead. Mm-hmm. But how do you, how do you preach the theme of American exceptionalism with more recent major issues, that Jim Crow laws,
Right, Jim Crow.
racism and other stuff that
Exactly.
extended through,
Exactly.
much more recent periods.
Well, I don't want to ignore these issues because they definitely need to be brought out. They need to be taught. Our kids need to understand. That this is it's like many times like making sausage. I mean, there's a lot of ugly elements that are there, and Jim Crow, was terrible. The South has struggled. I mean, they have been, on a path that is very difficult, not only to justify but that's the way I think history. This is the way I look at it. Mm-hmm. History must be judged strenuously and within historical context. Mm-hmm. Now, most of the Southern people were not slaveholders, but they allowed slavery. They didn't do anything really to stop it. They allowed it to exist. Mm-hmm. Today we have been plagued, I think, by the concept of teaching history using presentism. And I think this is a false concept where we look at the past and judge it by today's standards. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's as unjust as it will be 200 years from now to look at our time and judge us, by their standard, by the standards of, even a century from now, or even shorter time than that. And so you look at the past, you look at people, you realize that they were in a difficult situation. Mm-hmm. They're trying to survive. Most of the people of the South, and I mean, you go back to the people who originally brought slaves there, maybe you could make a case there. Mm-hmm. But the rest of the South, they're growing up around a black population. And, I look at it and I say, it was wrong. God knew that it was wrong, but had it been pushed at the time of the Declaration of Independence, the colonies never would have united.
Right.
We never would have stood against England successfully. It would not have been possible. It was a process. And Frederick Douglass, the great black emancipator during the Civil War, Frederick Douglass said, this is a note of a promissory note. This is a promissory note that's contained within the Declaration of Independence, that freedom will be afforded all Americans. Mm-hmm. And we expect this to be the case, and we want, we're going to work towards that, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. And I think everybody that was involved in the abolitionist movement knew that it would be a process. It would take generations to finally, look at the poverty in the South in many areas, not just among the blacks, but among, everyone. Mm-hmm. So people are struggling. And when you're living in a hand-to-mouth, very, difficult environment, your priorities are going to be very different. You're not going to look at somebody else and say, well, I think I should help them out when I can't feed my own kids. And so these things needed to improve, and they did over time. History must be judged strenuously and within historical context. And then we look at what happened after, and to see the hundreds of thousands of young men who died to free the slaves and to save the Union, to see the nation as it became during the 1900s, freeing the world in many areas from terrible tyrannies and other problems like that. And so I look at that and I say, this is a process. It's over time. We're improving. My grandfather used to tell me, he says, if you look at a generation, each generation should improve a little bit. He says, if you don't see that, something's wrong. And that's what concerns me about today, because I think there's an ideology that has been introduced, and I know where it came from. And I don't really want to get into that, but I mean, we could. But that ideology of secular progressivism, of critical theory, of cultural Marxism is creeping in to our society, being promoted the concept of, well, it's social justice. It's social justice. And I don't think that's the case. I think in many cases we're seeing injustices done to people. We live in a society where some people are going to accomplish more than others. And if we don't believe that they should be then rewarded more for their accomplishments, but at the same time, we need to give a hand up and help as many people as we can underneath. But we're never going to see a society where everyone is equal, everyone has equity in every way. It's just not going to happen, because every individual is different.
So this is kind of funny, because I think reasonably familiar with both sides of this argument. And we don't need to.
You're well versed in it, and that's why I was
not as well versed as I'd like to be. But so I think that there's. I don't want to say it's a disconnect, but when I hear people on the right talk, I want to think it's like, okay, how can we best present this to people that are coming at it from the left, and vice versa?
Right.
And so when you talk about the helping hand up, what do you have in mind? Like, what does that actually mean to you?
Well, to me, I think it depends on the strength of the hand that's helping. We need to have a strong, effective economy. We need to have a free environment where people can say and live their lives the way that they need to. But we also need to incorporate into that a moral society, and you can't force that on people. It needs to be taught to our kids. It says in the scriptures, that you teach a child the correct way to be as a child, and he will live that way through his life and throughout his life. We're not teaching those values to our kids because for some reason there's something, I don't know, it's Christianity or belief in God, things that need to be removed. You cannot remove those without turning the society into a tyranny, essentially a dictatorship, to enforce these issues that people should be doing voluntarily. And if they're taught those things within their religion, ultimately, I'm thinking in my mind, if I don't live a good life,
right,
there's a God I love in heaven who is going to be very disappointed in me. That's a motivator for me.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is going to embrace that, but I think if we teach that to our kids, I think it is very powerful. In my mind, it's not fooling myself. I believe this with all my heart. And I look at the past and I see so many of these great examples from our history that had the same belief, and it made this world a much better place. And it gave people opportunities that wouldn't have gotten them otherwise. It gave people a helping hand up because we view them as our brothers and sisters. That's what the gospel of Christ teaches. We're brothers and sisters. You don't squash your brother or your sister. You help them. And so I think teaching those things is essential. And yet we have a secular society today that has said, no, you can't do that anymore. And it's killing us. It really is. I don't know if you remember, just recently, a year or so ago, the Attorney General, William Barr, remember he spoke to Notre Dame? And he said in that speech, we have been taken by this secular progressive power that has completely changed the values of this nation. And unless we realize that and understand, and he got a standing ovation, and then the left just hammered him, after that, and said,
Yeah.
"You can't say these things. This is hateful speech, and so forth." And he was making the same point I'm trying to make, not very effectively, but he did it that way. And I think it's essential that we do these things, that we understand them. And that's one reason why when you look at these heroes, you find the Spirit of God, the motivation of Christ and angels is intertwined with the stories. Harriet Tubman, she believed that she had angels standing by her side, and she made nearly a score, nearly 20 different trips out of the South, freeing slaves, bringing them out, and she was never captured. Several times she would be going down in the middle of the night, slaves behind her, she's leading them out, and all of a sudden she stops. And she says, "We can't go that way. We can't go that way." And they would say, "Well, that's the way. That's where we get." "No, we can't go. We have to go this way." And she found when they go that way, they find out later there were slave hunters, bounty hunters waiting for them because they knew they were coming that way. And she, to her deathbed, she said, "The reason that I was so successful and people called me the modern Moses was because I was guided by the Spirit of God throughout my life." And she testified of that to her deathbed. And yet, when you read that account in my daughter's history book, any mention of spirituality is gone. There was a movie that came out recently called Harriet. I don't know if you saw it. It came out a few years. Excellent movie. And they talked about that spiritual element in that movie. Well, the Hollywood Reviewer savaged that movie afterwards, saying, "Why do you make her skill and ability something of mystical form when, can't you just honor her as a strong, capable woman?" And I thought, no, that's who she is. That's what makes her who she is. And her belief and her testimony was something that all of her life. And whenever she talked to young people and other people later in her life, she would always bear that testimony to them. People don't have to believe it. We're not forcing anyone. But the information needs to be available, or our kids are not going to make it in a secular world. I'm convinced of that.
It's interesting what you refer to. If we zoom out and look at that as a kind of broader thing, not that there hasn't always been one, but we're in an interesting moment where you do have, there are competing ideologies.
Oh, yeah.
And I think the hard thing for people is that it's very difficult to exist. You can do it. Maybe you can do it as an individual, but it's certainly hard. The more people you have to exist without any ideology, you're going to have one. Societies are going to organize around some ideology.
Secular progressivism is an ideology.
Well, and
it's
you go
an ideology.
You
of
go
its
to
own
the
secular ideology.
Yeah, I mean, so you go to any of the you go to the Soviet Union, you go to any of the former communist countries that Albania, where I served my mission, was the first country to outlaw religion. It was the first formally atheist state.
Yeah, I bet that was fascinating.
It was deeply fascinating. But you can see, even in the countries that have outlawed religion, they still adopted some other ideology religiously, in a sense.
Right.
And that's something that for people on the left, for pluralists, you always, I don't know. It's just I don't really have any conclusions at this point as to what people should do. But it seems like it's not realistic for 8 billion people, or for 340 million people, if we're just going to talk about the U.S., to adopt like a sort of Nietzschean Superman, like everyone gets to create their own ideology from the ground up and choose that. It's not quite as well. That's you run into issues.
That's what communist governments and other types of fashion. That was Nazi. It was the cult of Hitler. I mean, it was it's human nature to want to look to something that's greater and better. And
to organize things.
It's organized. And exactly. But you can't. The thing I think it revolves around is freedom. It's freedom. If you allow people the freedom, unencumbered, and that's the beauty of this incredible, and I believe, inspired Constitution. freedom of speech. People are going to say things that you just cannot stand. But the alternative is when you start saying, okay, we're going to become the freedom of speech monitors. We're the sheriff on freedom of speech. What right does anybody have to do that? You can't. Obviously, there's got to be some limits that may cause people death and problems like that. But in general, people I think are going to be better off if they have those freedoms, and the freedom of religion. To not be in some religions believe things as long as they're not harming others, directly harming them, or forcing people to do anything. That freedom, those freedoms are essential, and that's why people are coming here by the millions. You open the borders, you can tell everything you want to know about a country. Just open the borders to see what happens. If people flee out, or are they coming in? That tells you right there.
That's actually pretty funny, and it is interesting that obviously immigration was a huge problem in this last election, or a huge issue.
Yeah,
and people hit on Biden and then Harris very hard for lack of border enforcement, but even if you concede that they opened the border and didn't really enforce it, the fact that a bunch of people were trying to come is actually kind of a nice sign. It's it's a nice compliment to the country.
Oh, it's incredible. I would, and I say this, I don't say this lightly or to make points or anything, but all my life, the people I admired most were people who were willing to give their lives for this country, for the ideals this country stands for the Constitution. And the older I get, the more important that is to me. And I would do that in a heartbeat. And I hope that our children and our grandchildren understand what they have. Look around. We get, sometimes we can't see the forest for the trees because we grow up with it. But I worked in Angola, Africa for a time, and you come back here and the Middle East, to see what was taking place in that terrible Iran-Iraq war and how those people were, treated by their leaders and by their officers, just brutally, and just like, worse than cannon fodder, I love this country and what it stands for and what it stood for. Is it perfect? No, it's never perfect, but there's no country that's perfect.
Right.
And again, history must be judged strenuously and within historical context.
Yeah.
Right.
let me end with three little questions, and you can do a short answer or a long answer.
Yeah.
One, how many people, I haven't asked this of someone before, but how many people do you think there are that are kind of ideologically aligned with you? Out of the 340 million in the U.S., do you feel like you're in a minority, in a majority? How do you think of yourself?
That's a hard question, I think, Nick, to answer, because some people would agree with some of the things that and some would perhaps not agree. I'm a very strong opponent against abortion. There are many who would be probably consider themselves conservative, but not on that issue. So I think it's tough, but I think that there's enough. I think there's enough common ground. You look at some of the recent polls. In some areas, there's a lot of agreement by people in this country. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of common ground that we can bring together. That there's some possibilities there, but I think that the concepts of the radical left in this country, there's no way that I could compromise with them. We can't come together on the views that they have. And when they're talking about, well, I don't want to get into specifics, but I don't think that there's any common ground there with the radical left, which I think is probably about 20% of the population maybe of this country. And so we've still got a majority of people, I think, who are reasonably thinking, along the lines of, what can bring together. So I see hope for this country, but it's going to take voices that are sound. I've heard a lot of insanity lately, from people,
So this is going to sound like a funny question then.
Yeah.
And I already had this planned. This is one of the last three.
Yeah.
I want you to, and you're going to like the last question more, or it's going to be easier to answer. Well, actually, okay, then I'll ask. Okay, then I got three more.
Okay.
First one, is there anything, okay, so not the radical left, but Democratic Party generally, is there anything you agree with in policy or on which you can appreciate their motivations?
No.
Yeah, it's funny because I asked a very similar question of a Democrat who was on recently. I wanted to pick one thing out that he liked that Trump had done, and he couldn't answer that. So okay, so not on policy or motivations.
On the major issues, no.
Okay.
It's scaring me when I see
Okay.
the gulf that exists here between what people want,
Okay.
what the left wants.
Then next question, second to last question. Is,
Uh-huh.
what's something that you see in the modern Republican Party that you dislike?
I think there's too often a desire by many of the Republicans to go the route that Romney went. I just don't. I don't feel. I see some of the decisions that he's made, and I think it empowers the radical left. Rather than when he was marching with Black Lives Matter, and when we know since then we've learned a lot about this organization, and if he would have said, I believe in the Black Lives Matter, but I'm not, going to participate in some of these, I would have respected him. But I didn't respect him for what he was doing that, on that day when he marched with that. I have some very good friends who are gay, and I realize that these people need to be respected, and they need everyone needs to be loved. Everybody needs to be to have the opportunities, fair opportunities in this society, and we need to ensure that that's the case. But at the same time, when you see some of the more radical elements trying to indoctrinate our kids at younger and younger ages in the LGBTQ, views, some of their views, you see this in many of the school districts with these really young kids. And I think this is not right. There's any kind of sexual indoctrination at these, and they say, well, they need to hear it. They need it, and I'm not sure that's the case. And so, anything like that, where you're dealing with our kids, particularly younger kids, people need to grow to maturity, and they need to make their own decisions. But it's easy to indoctrinate a kid from an early age if old Hitler said the same thing. Give me your 4-year-olds. And I'll create even better Third Reich. He understood. Take these kids at a younger age. Lenin said essentially the same thing. So we need to leave these kids alone when it comes to a lot of these more radical ideas.
Okay. And final question.
Yeah.
What makes you hopeful for the future? What gives you hope?
The thing that really, to be honest, Nate, is my faith. Faith in Christ and in God, faith in the fact that the men and women I know in this country, even today, even when we don't agree, I see in their hearts a spark of incredible divinity, of great goodness. And that makes me happy. I don't see the evil. When I was with the agency, we penetrated a number of terrorist organizations, and I looked into the eyes of really true evil. People who, I don't see that in Americans. I see a spark of divineness, of a desire, to make their world better, and that is, I think, it's a matter of education. It really is, to help people understand just exactly who we are, where we come from, and if we know that, we know where we come from. I think we can better plan where we're going in the future, and I hope that people remember. To me, this country is a wonderful country that it is. I tell you, it is not a dream. This country is a miracle. It's a miracle.
Let's leave it at that. That's a good final line. Rick Robison, been
Thank
awesome
you.
talking to you.
Yeah, always. You're amazing. You always have been, ever since you were just a little guy.
Appreciate it. Little guy with a lot more hair. Appreciate it. Thanks,
Thank
Rick.
you. I appreciate it.
All right, and that was the interview. Thank you very much for listening. If you wouldn't mind, please do leave a review for the podcast. I believe those are important. And subscribe to the newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes, or can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com. Thanks.